Welcome to the Book of Exodus series on the Town and Field Church podcast. In this 40-day series, one of us at Town and Field will be taking a quick look at one of the chapters of Exodus and sharing some ideas around the text. To learn more about this reading plan and podcast, visit townandfield.ca/reading plans. Now enjoy today's episode.
Hey, this is Ryan. Thanks for joining me today for Exodus 12. This is it. This is the Exodus. This is what we've been waiting for. The Israelites finally get to go free. I'm going to make a couple comments on some things in this chapter, and I really want to focus back in on one section, so we'll come toward that at the end. But in this chapter, what's going on is God's preparing the Israelites and saying, hey, I'm bringing you out of Egypt, and he gives them all these really specific instructions about their feast and how they're supposed to leave and all that. And this is such a significant event that in verse 2, it's so interesting. God says, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. This is such a significant event that God's saying, time is restarting now. Your calendars will be marked by this event. Then he gives them a whole bunch of instructions about this thing, the Passover, where he's going to strike down the firstborn of the Egyptian families, but not the Israelites, and he's going to pass them over, and he gives them all these instructions. We'll come back to that. And one thing that I think is really interesting after that is at verse 26 again. I mentioned this in one of the earlier podcasts. God says, when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Then you're supposed to explain it. I just love this idea of remembering. This is a theme throughout the Old Testament, throughout Scripture, where God says, remember who I am. I'll always remember. And it's so easy for us to forget who Jesus is. Verse 29 and 30 is when we see when this tragic thing happens, where God comes in and just puts to death the firstborn of the Egyptian families. And again, I think there's a lot of irony in the book of Exodus, and here we see it again. Remember, Pharaoh starts out in chapter 1. He sets out to kill all the firstborn, or all the newborn boys of the Hebrews. Here God steps in and he shows him that he's the one that actually has power over life and death. So then this happens, and Pharaoh says, get out of here. So the Israelites take off. You see at the end of verse 36, they get all this money from the Egyptians, and they take off. And in verse 37, it says there are about 600,000 men on foot besides women and children. Some scholars would say, based on kind of how the translation works and all that, it's actually not that big. But either way, we've got anywhere from a small size city to a mid-sized city to maybe all of Vancouver going on this journey together. It's this pretty epic journey they're about to take off on. Something I want to comment on at the end of the chapter, kind of verse 43 through 49, is there's this mention where God says, don't let the foreigners take part in the Passover. And at first read, we might be well, that's kind of weird. But then as you read on, God says, if there's a foreigner and they want to take part, they need to actually get circumcise their household, and become part of this covenant people. What we see is that God actually creates this wide open kingdom, this wide open people who says people can join. They just got to be serious. They got to get in on the covenant. They got to step up and say, I'm in. It's not just kind of oh, I'm sampling God. I'm kind of checking it out. And no other religions or ancient cultures were like this. It was, we're the Egyptians, the foreigners are slaves. And right here we see this gospel being this wide open table to everyone. I love it. One thing I want to focus in on, and I think this is going to be helpful hopefully as we read through Exodus, is the intense instructions that God gives around the Passover. He tells them how much food to get, what food to get, how to make it, don't use yeast, do this, don't do that, the timing and all of that. And it seems kind of intense. And as you read Exodus, once we get past chapter 20, there are going to be a lot of specific instructions around things. You might be this is tough to read, what's going on? And I think there's kind of this mirroring effect going on where God calls the Pharaoh to obedience. God says, let my people go, and the Pharaoh chooses to disobey him, and great judgment comes on him. God calls his people to great obedience. He says, I know what's best for you. I am your king. I am your God. I am the all-powerful one, and calls them to great obedience. And I think this laying out of specific instructions is actually an act of grace to say, listen, I'm giving you an opportunity to exercise obedience and to walk in my grace. And he gives them some very specific steps and ways to do that, ways to kind of rehearse that and represent that. And this is important for us to think about, because I think we can be like Pharaoh, who picks and chooses what we obey and what we don't obey. If you're following with us on Sunday mornings, we're reading through Matthew. And we're about to get to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says things don't even be angry with a brother or sister. Don't even look at a woman lustfully. Well, what do? Well, I love everyone, but we'll still let ourselves be angry. Or, I kind of watch some of this stuff. Maybe there's a bit of lust, but it's not that bad. Other people do worse. Jesus lays out crazy teachings, and we so often try to compromise our obedience to kind of like normalize to the world. And that's not what we're called to. And so as you read Exodus and you think about these specific instructions, think about the grace that God is giving by saying, I am making it possible. I'm giving you kind of a playbook, a script that you can follow along. You can exercise obedience actively. And it's actually a great invitation into his amazing kingdom.